Okay, let's get to work now on some of the stats down at the bottom. This video we're going to focus on calculating the total and also the average distance. Now to do this, we are going to make use of a JavaScript array method called reduce. So let's take a quick look at how we can use this. If you've not used the reduce method before, it can look pretty complex, but it's really not too difficult to use. The main concept behind a reduce method is it will take all of the elements or all of the values which is inside of an array. In our case, it's going to be all of our distances, and then we're going to reduce it into one single value. And in our case, we're going to reduce down all of our values by adding them all together. This is going to give us our total, which we need just here. And then we can also make use of this in the average distance by dividing this total by the number of entries. Back to the reducer, we're going to create a function just like this. So the example we see here is pretty much exactly how we need to use it. We're going to add together all of the values in the array. We do this by calling a method which adds the current value to the previous total. So for the first element inside of the array, which is 1, it will then call this method. For this first time, we only have the current value, we don't have the total. So the reducer will be equal to 1. For the second value, which is 2, the current value of 2 will be added to the total of 1, resulting in a value of 3. Continuing on, the value of 3 will then be added to the current total, making this 6. The value of 4 then completes the reducer, resulting in a total value of 10. So back over to our script.js, we're going to begin by creating a function which is going to have this same behavior. I'm going to do mine just above our handle submit. So the function, which I'm going to call the reducer, takes in our two values, which is the total and then the current value. I've just called this a total rather than accumulator since it seems more clear. All this function is going to do is to return the new value, which is the equivalent of the total, which has been added to the current value. Just as a side note here, we are adding the current value to the total, but you could do other things such as take it away too. The whole idea is exactly the same. The reducer is intended to reduce our array values into one single value. The next thing to do is we are going to create a new function just below. And I'm going to call this calcTotal. This function is going to grab all of our entries, use the reducer method, and then update our value just here. To do this, it also needs to take in all of our current entries, which is inside of our array. We can then grab our entries array, which is all the values stored inside of here. We can then call the reduce method, which we just looked at on the Mozilla website, and then we can pass in our reducer function. This will then give us our single total value, and we can also store this inside of a constant. Great, so now we have this value, we are going to update the DOM. The two values which we want to update, if we take a look at our project, is the total section just here. And we also have a total which is updated for our weekly target. So let's grab the document. We can grab an element by the ID. The first one which we want to grab is for the total just here. Scroll down to the data section and we have a span with the ID of total. We can then set the inner text content to be equal to our total value. Let's duplicate this line, and we can also use this to update the weekly target. Down at the bottom of our index page, this is this progress total, which currently has the value of 0. We can remove the placeholder, update our ID. So we now have our function which calculates the total. In fact, this should just be calcTotal. So now every time we handle submit down at the bottom, we now want to call this function. When we call this, we can also pass in the entries. So the entries was the value from our array up at the very top here, or we can leave this empty for this particular case because this is a global variable. when we declare a variable outside of any of these functions, this means this is now in global scope, meaning that we can access the value of entries anywhere inside of our program. If our variable was declared inside of any particular function, we could only access it inside of that function. So since this is global, we can access this inside of this function and also this one just here too. With this in place, now let's save this and over to the browser. Let's add some new values. So 1 and 2. These two added up give us the total of 3, and also down in our target 2. Let's add one more. And our totals are now updated. With this working, now let's move on to the average distance. The average distance is going to be pretty simple because we already have our reducer function in place. So all we need to do is to create a new function to take care of this. And I'm going to call this calc average. So the way we can calculate the average is to first grab all of the total values which we've added together, and we know how to do this from our function just above. Then we can divide it by how many entries we currently have, giving us the average. Let's store this inside of a constant called average. Set this equal to our entries array. We can again call our reduce method, passing in our reducer function. This will then give us the total, and the next thing we need to do is to divide this by the number of entries. We can do this by grabbing our entries array and then calling .length. The next step is to update the DOM with document.getElementById. The ID which we want to grab over in the index.html is this average ID just here. Just like above, we'll also set the inner text to be equal to our average variable from above. The last step is to actually call this function, so calc average. This also doesn't need anything passed to it since it's only taking advantage of the entries array which we have at the top. So save this file and over to the browser. Now if we add in two different values, we see the total of 4, and the total of 4 divided by 2 gives us the average of 2. Let's try add one more. Let's go for 10. And our average is now updated. Just one more finishing touch we can do to this project for these two values is to round these to one decimal place. At the moment we get a rounded number of 14, but if we do something such as 2.7, we then want to keep this consistent and make sure all values are to one decimal place. Just like earlier, the way to do this is to use toFixed. We're going to set this to be one decimal place, so pass in the value of 1. This is going to be for our total, and we can do the same for our average too. Here we need to wrap this inside of our brackets, and then call toFixed on the total. If we didn't wrap this in brackets, toFixed would be called on the entries.length rather than the total sum. Okay, let's test this out. So 1 and 5, giving us the total of 6, which has the value of 6.0 now, the average. Let's add some more values. We can now see our total and average is rounded to one decimal place. We can also do the same for our entries just here. We can do this up above where we created our new entries. And also here where we add the new entry as our text node. Just like before, we can also call toFixed, passing in the value of 1. And now if we add some entries, we see these are rounded to one decimal place. This is now our total and the average now taken care of. And in the next video, we'll take a look at the weekly goal and also the weekly high.